Every time you make a new Power BI report, there's a million things you need to remember to do. So the basic ones like sharing your report and scheduling refresh are pretty easy to remember. But if you're trying to follow best practices, there's a bunch more things to do and it can be really difficult to keep track of them all. So what I like to do is make a checklist for this, and I'm going to show you everything on my checklist. And we're going to go through how to build something where you can actually record that you have done everything on the checklist, because this is really good data for you. As a report developer, you are often asked to make KPIs for other teams. And what'll happen is eventually somebody will come and ask you to do a KPI for your team. And they usually start with things like, hey, why don't we measure how long it takes to complete new report tickets or how many tickets you did? And we all know those are kind of useless for the sort of work we do, right? So we want to build a better KPI. And if we are going through a checklist for every single report that we make and we are trying to follow best practices, we should record that we are doing that so that we can provide measurable results. It also makes you look good, so it makes you look like you've got it together and that your team has it together. Your manager will probably love it because it makes them look good. There's a ton of reasons why you would want to do this. So let's talk about where you would want to put this checklist. So right now I am using a Microsoft list because it's super easy to set up and it gives me actual physical records for the checklists that I've submitted. And you can trigger automation on those. So say if you wanted to build an approval flow on top of it that would feed into a certification process for reports, that would be a really cool idea. You could use an Excel file if you really want to, but I feel like structured data is better. And this really is not more difficult to set up than an Excel file. So let's go through how to make this. So I'm going to start with the app launcher in the top left corner of Microsoft 365, and I'm going to select the option for lists. So Microsoft lists are also known as SharePoint lists. They look like different things, but they're actually the same thing. They're like literally the same object. They're just viewed in different ways. So I'm going to go and create a new list here, and we're going to make this a blank list. We'll just call this new report. You can choose a color and an icon if you want to, and then choose where to save it. And you do not want to use My Lists here. So My Lists is your personal OneDrive, essentially, and it's going to get deleted if you leave your organization. So pick something that is more of a shared team space. So for example, I've got one for data and reporting here. If you don't have a site that looks like a good place to put it, you could make one. All right, so here's our list. It comes with a title field. I'm going to rename this to report title. And we can get started adding our columns. So just click on add column here to the left, and I'm going to add a choice column. This is going to be our report status. So this is going to make it easier to find the checklists that are in progress later because you can filter on these fields. And you can choose colors for these if you want to. Maybe we'll make deprecated gray. And for the default value, let's set that to in development, because chances are if we are creating a new checklist, it's for a report that is in development. And our next column is something that's going to hold the name of the person who is managing the report. So usually that's the person creating the report, but what happens is over time, you start needing to transition reports to other people. So as people join and leave the organization, as roles change, that kind of thing. So you want to make it something that you can use for that. So we can call that really whatever we want to. I'm going to call it report owner here. And we want it to be person or group type, and we want to not allow multiple selections unless you have multiple owners of reports. I should probably make this column required and save. So this next field is going to be the primary business contact. So this is not the report developer. This is the person in the business who is the point of contact for it. And keep in mind that there is a field for this in Power BI in the report settings. However, the issue with that is that data isn't accessible anywhere. So it's not even in the Power BI admin API last I checked. So you can't report on it at all, and you can't easily pull up a list of who owns what unless you keep track of it separately. And some of this information could be if you have a ticketing system that you're already tracking this info in. Obviously, you don't need to have it down twice. I'm just kind of using this as the place to hold all of the metadata about the reports that are being built. So So our next one is going to be report criticality. So this one is kind of important because you want to be able to know which of your reports are critical in the case that you have a outage of some kind and you need to prioritize what needs to be brought back and up and running the fastest, or contact the business owners or that kind of thing. And you can add a description in these fields. So the description will show up under the field name when somebody is filling out the form for this. You could describe what the different levels of report criticality are here. And I like to put numbers in front of these because it makes it easier to sort later if you're reporting on it. And I also tend to take out the extra colors for things that don't need it, just because when you get a lot of fields in here, it can get kind of overwhelming if you have colors on everything. And then our last column for our metadata is going to be a hyperlink column, and this is going to be the hyperlink to the report. So this is your one link to which report you're talking about for your checklist. So which report actually is it? The hyperlink for reports contains the report ID, and that's going to be important if you decide you want to report on this data later. That's how you match it up with the stuff that's in the Power BI admin APIs. And I'm going to make this required. This is one of those tricky things, is that in order to get a report hyperlink, you have to have published your report. And oftentimes, if you're developing a report, you probably haven't published it yet because you're still working on it, right? So I usually publish my report early in the draft stage and then work on my checklist as I go along, just so that I can get that report hyperlink. And that's usually fine because the way the permissions work in Power BI, you're sharing a report, not the workspace. And so publishing it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody has access to it other than your team. So it's okay to publish early. Let's save that. And then we're going to get on to our checklist items. So these checklist items, I'm intentionally not using a checkbox for the checklist items because I need to be able to select not applicable for some checklist items, because you're not always going to need to do every single thing on the checklist. And you need to differentiate those times when you are not doing something because it's not necessary versus not doing something because you haven't gotten to it yet. And by the way, I put a link in the video description to a blog post that has all of these in it, so that if you need to refer back to it later, it's a lot easier to skim some text versus going back and trying to click through this video. So we're going to add choice columns, and they're all going to be set up pretty much the same way. So they're going to have the same values. So we're going to make this first one published to shared workspace. And we're going to make our choices NA, yes, and no. And for all of these checklist items, we're going to make these not required because there are going to be a lot of these yes, no, NA checklist items, and we don't want to have to fill them all out the very first time we're starting our checklist. So we're going to make them not required. And by the way, by published to shared workspace, what I mean by this is the report living somewhere in Power BI that is not the personal workspace? You don't want to be publishing reports that need to outlive you to your personal workspace, because that gets deleted if you leave your organization. Put them someplace where your team has access to it, okay? So we're going to save this, and then I'm going to show you my trick for adding columns where you don't have to go through and set the color choices every time. So if you go to this gear menu up here, and then go to list settings, you get kind of the old school view. So we're just going to go to create column, this hyperlink about halfway down the page. And this is going to do exactly the same thing we've been doing. It's just going to be doing it in a slightly less newfangled way. So our next checklist item is going to be viewer access granted. So these first checklist items are honestly the most common sense ones, which is intentional because these are the things that you really need to remember to do when you launch a report, because I think we've all been there where we send out a link to something and then realize that we forgot to share it before we sent the link out. So we're going to make this choice and then enter our choices down here. And you can copy and paste these, it makes it a little bit faster. And I'm going to choose to not add it to the default view because we're going to end up with about 20 checklist items here, and that's going to go scrolling way off to the side, and I don't feel like it adds value to have every single one of these be in the list view. So I'm going to uncheck that. You can remove the default choice if you want to, then click OK. All right, so we're going to continue this process for all of the things in our checklist. We're going to go to create column. We're going to add in our NA yes, no, decide whether or not we want it in the view. I'm going to actually show you what these best practices look like and talk about that as we go through these instead of going through the create column menu for every single one, because that would be pretty boring. Our next checklist item is refresh scheduled. So make sure that your refresh is scheduled, obviously. The thing you want to think about here is what is your refresh frequency? So by default, once a day is usually fine. Do you need it to be more frequent than that? Also think about, do you want to have it set to a particular time? Because having all of your refreshes get triggered at the default time, which is midnight, is going to cause you some problems if you have a lot of reports, if they all try to refresh at the same time, right? So you can change the time in these things. Let me go to one that actually has one scheduled. Refresh will let you specify a specific time here. You can keep adding times up to 8 per day on a pro license. Our next one is going to be in the same view. So this is the alternate refresh contact. So the refresh failure notifications will by default go to whoever the dataset owner is, or the semantic model owner. Sorry, I got to get used to the new lingo. The option here is to check the box for these contacts and then enter something else here. And you want to do this, you want it to go to a distribution group or a Microsoft 365 group mailbox, so that if you're on PTO, somebody else can back you up and know that your report refresh failed, right? Put something in that box, try and do it for all the reports you create. That will make things easier for you in the long run. And our next item on our checklist is going to be, have you validated the numbers in your report? So this is a quality control thing. So have somebody sign off that the numbers look right. If you can get somebody other than you to sign off on that, it is more of a CYA thing. And we can move on to our next one, which is your PBIX stored in somewhere that your team has access to that is backed up? I like to use SharePoint for this because it's easy. So you could put your PBIX files in the same site that your checklist lives in if you want to. Just make sure you think about the permissions when you do that. So by default, everything in your site has the same permissions. Let me go to our site for an example. So when we were adding those columns in our list, it automatically sent us to the SharePoint site that it lives in. So I'm already here. And our document library is right here. So every SharePoint site comes with a document library. You could sync this library with the sync button here, and it'll sync down to your computer. You can then create Power BI files from there. It looks like this. Let me see. Right. So this is my dev tenant. Here's my synced library. If you create files from here, they'll automatically sync up to SharePoint and you'll get a version history on them. And on to our next one. It is your refresh running under a service account or a service principal? So this is a bit of a big topic. So the thing to think about here is that the refreshes are going to be running under the account that owns them by default. If that account is your user account and you leave your organization, they will all fail. So it's considered best practice to run those with a service account or a service principal so that that doesn't happen. If you think this doesn't sound like something you want to think about now, that's fine. Just keep in mind that you might be one of those people that is going to go clean up after somebody else's mess someday. So pay it forward and try and future-proof your stuff. And our next one is there documentation available for the viewers of your report? So the way I have done this in the past that worked pretty well for me is to just add another tab to your report. So you can call it report information. And the way I've done this before is our team used a kind of a standardized template for the report information. So the report information always had the same info, like where is this data coming from? How often does it refresh? What time of day does it refresh? And you put that inside the report because your viewers can't see where the data is coming from. Your report developers can because they can go in the query editor and look at it, but your viewers can't see that. And if you don't put that information in here, they will come asking you for it. So you may as well just make it available. This would be the place where you would also put definitions of your measures and also link to other systems here. So if you keep all of your documentation in Confluence or whatever, you can link to that. And then we are on to Power Query for the next ones. So for Power Query, our first checklist item for this is, do your tables have friendly names? So in Power BI, your table names can have proper punctuation and spaces. It's recommended that you do that. It just helps people understand what's going on in your report better when they're looking at it, right? It also helps the natural language queries work better. And then next is, do those tables have descriptions? So to be honest, I don't do this for every single table. But if you have a table that has a little bit more going on in it, or is unfamiliar or new or whatever, you can put a description in here. I don't know if you caught that, but I right-clicked on the table and went to properties. That's where the description is. And then query folding. So the way that query folding works is that the first non-foldable step will break query folding for the rest of your query. And query folding is essentially pushing back the processing for the ETL to the source. So if you've got a SQL source, it essentially translates your Power Query steps into SQL and runs the SQL query for those instead of having Power BI handle all the processing. And that makes your refreshes a lot faster and more efficient. So any query steps that are foldable, you want to do first in your query. So that means filtering, removing columns you don't need, group by actions. You want to do those all up front if you are able to. And speaking of filtering your data set and removing the columns you don't need, those are both things to put in your checklist as well. So if your SQL table has 200 columns on it and you don't need all 200 columns, select the columns you want to keep, right click, and then go to remove other columns to take out those extras, because those 200 columns take up space in your model if you don't remove them in Power Query. Particularly text fields that are unique text, like a GUID column, is going to add a lot of bloat to your data model. So if you don't need those things, remove them. Same goes for the rows. So if your data table goes back to 2003 and you don't need your report to go back to 2003, then filter some of that out. So another Power Query best practice is to intentionally set your step names. So you'll notice for these are two custom column calculations. So if you right click on it and go to properties, name the step something that makes it pop. So for custom columns, I always prefix it with the word custom in all caps. You can do whatever kind of naming convention you want. Particularly for these conditional and custom columns, though, if you have more than one, it gets next to impossible to go back and find it later in your applied steps to edit it if you don't give it a explicit name. You can also add a description here if you have information about why something was done. It'll show up as a little eye icon next to this step. And you don't need to do this for every single step in your query, although I guess that if you have time, that would be lovely. But the ones that are important steps or that could use some explanation, it's really good to do for those. So that was all of our Power Query checklist items. Let's go on to DAX now. So some ideas for this would be, say, to format your DAX measures, meaning to have proper tabs and going to new lines for your functions. That would be considered a best practice. Also adding comments to your DAX. So you can do a double / and add comments about how the measure was calculated, why you calculated it a certain way. So for example, here I could be like, divide by 100 to make percentage, that kind of thing. Bonus points if you put your name or your initials in your comments, if you're working on a report that you think could ever potentially be transferred to someone else, so that if somebody has questions, they knew who to ask. And next up is measure organization. So I like to do the thing where you create a table to hold all of your measures all in one place, as opposed to creating them on each individual table in your report. So to do that, under the Home tab, you just go to Enter Data here and create a blank table. You can call it, I usually go with underscore measures because that makes it sort to the top of the table list over here. But you can call it whatever. I already got one here, so I'm not going to create another one. But essentially then when you create a new column, you just create it on this table and then they all live together in the same place. You can also move these measures between tables. So if you decide to go back and update your report to do that, you can just go to the model view on the left-hand side here. And then you can drag and drop measures from here into your measures table. And in this view, you can also create folders. So to create a folder, you just select one of your measures and then enter a display folder here. So you can call this example folder, hit enter, and it'll put that in a folder. And then you can drag and drop other things into here. So just like that. You can also do that for multiple at a time. So you can shift click a whole bunch of these, drag them into a folder. So while you're in here, this is a great place to set your column formatting explicitly. So for your date fields, make them some kind of short date instead of, Tuesday, January 15th, 2023, that kind of thing. And also be intentional about the number of decimal places you're showing. So if you don't need to show your 2 decimal places, then set your decimal places to 0 here. You can do that for multiple measures at the same time by shift clicking or control clicking the ones that you want to change and setting it here. And one more thing to do while you're in the model view is to hide the fields that you don't want people using in the visual view. So those would be things like extra ID columns. When you have a relationship, you often have the same ID column on both ends of the relationship, right? And you only need to show one of those in the report. So choose the one that you don't want people to use and hide it with the little eyeball icon. And something else to consider is the date hierarchy. So in Power BI, if you go to the File menu and then Options and Settings, Options, there's a date hierarchy option that most people who are very familiar with Power BI get super annoyed by and turn off. It's considered best practice to disable it. So that's under data load. There's an option for turning time intelligence, this auto date time, off for new files. So that'll do it for all files that you create, or you can turn it off in your current file here, auto date time off. If you do this, you need to use a date table. I highly recommend using a date table if you're not already. It's a very useful thing. All right, so our next category of checklist items is design and accessibility. So number 1 in this category is to use an organizational theme or template if you have one available. If you don't have one available, consider making one. So the themes are under the View tab here. If you go to this drop-down menu, you can customize the current theme. And then you can save that theme as a file and reuse it in other reports. It's a good time savings thing, and it generally makes the reports in your organization feel more coherent if they adhere to your brand guidelines. This one is to reduce visual noise where possible. So this kind of plays into the column formatting a little bit when we remove the extra decimals. That's considered reducing noise, but also just reducing the amount of stuff on a page and being intentional about where you use color, where you use bold fonts to try and draw attention to what you want your viewers to be looking at. And a really good way to do this, by the way, is to use field parameters. So field parameters can drastically reduce the number of visuals you need to get information across because they let you dynamically set measures and dimensions in your visuals. They're cool. And next up is contrast. So contrast is an important consideration for accessibility. People who are visually impaired need high contrast. There are a ton of websites out there. I'll link one in the video description that essentially you give it your color palette and it tells you if you have sufficient contrast or not. So simple ways you can do this are just avoiding using light gray font on a white background or yellow font on a white background, that kind of thing. And as far as accessibility goes, Meagan Longoria has a really great blog about Power BI accessibility, so I'll link that in the video description also. And next is, have you done the necessary accommodation for screen readers if you have visually impaired people in your organization? So screen readers are a tool that goes through and reads the text in your report and the numbers in your report for people who can't see. And I did a video on what this looks like. I'll link that also. I'm going to have a lot of links in the description at this point. There's a spot in Power BI where you can specify what order things get read in by the screen reader, and you probably want to do that because oftentimes by default it's going to be reading it in the order that you created them in, not necessarily the order that they appear on the page. So check that out. And then another accessibility one is your report colorblind friendly? So you'll see this oftentimes with people that use red and green colors to indicate good and bad. You need to also include either an icon or a color density difference or some way that people who are red-green colorblind or completely colorblind can tell the difference between those two colors. So that was everything on my checklist. I am super interested if you have anything that you think is important that I didn't mention. Please let me know in the comments because I'm kind of collecting these things over time, trying to make something comprehensive. So thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.